What I would like to do at this point in time is I would like to kind of turn it over to you. Because although I'm an okay speaker, I'm really good at answering questions. I don't know why that is, but I think I am. So you might think I'm not, but that's okay. Leave me in my delusion. And so I would like to see if people have questions. And you might say, I don't know if I should ask that because people might think it's stupid. Well, I'll usually think it's a good question, and the more stupid, the better. No, that didn't sound right. But anyway, but I would love it. So if you have questions, something that you've been dying to ask, or something that occurs to you in what I said, I would love to hear from you. So yes, we have 2 questions. We have enough questions to be here all afternoon. We'll start there. Yeah.
We hear about many First Nations having bad social situations.
Yes.
On their reserves. Is the church doing anything specific to address those?
Yeah.
Other than simply saying hope?
Yes. Well.
Repeat the question.
Okay. So here's the question: is we're aware of a lot of social problems in indigenous communities. And the question is the church doing anything about that situation other than just to utter the word hope? A very good question, a very important question. Well, the first thing that you need to understand that in 225 indigenous communities, the church is the only social service that's on the ground 24/7. And so one of the first ways that we contribute to the life of the communities is that we help people deal with the difficulties and problems and grief that is so much a part of so many indigenous communities. That's an important thing. But we're also active in a number of other levels. We're active in terms of advocacy with the government, and we are particularly active on the issue of clean water. We do a lot of advocacy on that. We do advocacy on other aspects of life, because a great deal of the problem exists in the archaic relationship between Canadian government and First Nations governments. That's a real huge problem. And so we help to advocate on those issues. But in addition to that, we have 3 workers who work on suicide as a particular issue, and we have other people who are working on other kinds of programs and projects. One of the things that we're doing, which might seem insignificant to people, is that we have been developing a program of teaching indigenous young people how to do music. Now, I have to say, not the kind of music that we heard here, which I loved and was very beautiful, but we go out into communities and we bring guitars, ukuleles, banjos, and a number of other things like that, fiddles. They're not violins, they're fiddles when you get out there in the bush. And we are teaching people how to use them. And the amazing thing, this program started when I was the Bishop of Alaska, before I became the bishop here. But in all those communities where those programs have developed, they haven't had a single suicide since they developed. In other words, this has been a way of developing hope and community in places with great difficulty. So there are a number of ways in which we're trying to help on the ground. I think that what I need to say is that in my role, although I worry about the church, I'm more worried about how the church can help the situation rather than I am about how the church is doing. So we don't see the church as an organization within a community. We see the church as part of a community. And so we want to see the church be active. And so a lot of our training, a lot of work, a lot of our preaching is towards church people being good neighbors and good community members. So I know that doing work in the community are a priority for many congregations, and I'm impressed at all the things that this church is doing. What I need to say about churches in indigenous communities is that they are much more interwoven into every aspect of community life in those communities. When the church gets together in Northern Ontario, all of the chiefs attend. So it would be like the church getting together in Toronto and having the mayor come, you know. They see the church as an integral part of the future and an integral part of the solutions to the problems that are there. So the church has this is a really high on its agenda. And so thank you for that question. I hope it's a stab at an answer. And maybe some more will be said when we have other questions. There was another question. Yes?
This require a very short answer. I was just curious when you mentioned that LA was number 1 and Toronto 2, 3.
Yeah.
Which was the second most popular?
Well, there's this big debate whether Winnipeg is bigger than Toronto. So, and if you go to Winnipeg, they assure you they're the second largest indigenous community. And actually, you're more apt to hear they're the most important indigenous community in the universe. But that's Winnipeg. Anyway, so there's a huge question. People don't really understand the Toronto indigenous community because it's much more diverse, much more diffused, and it isn't made up of 1 or 2 different First Nations. It's made up of Inuit, it's made up of Métis, it's made up of Ojibwe, it's made of the Six Nations. It's all of these people. So it's really hard. There was a survey done of indigenous people in Toronto, and the people said it's just a stab in the dark. We don't really know because the community is so diffused in Toronto life. So Winnipeg. Winnipeg's either second or third, or Toronto's second or third. But Edmonton's coming up close on our heels. So we'll see what happens. I've seen estimates of the population in Canada from, the population in the Toronto metro area being anywhere from 40,000 to 85,000 indigenous people. LA is 100,000. Last time I talked to somebody from Winnipeg, they said, well, Winnipeg's 100,000. Well, yeah, okay. Love Winnipeg, but they rightly see themselves as a very central indigenous community. So there you go. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes.
Is there a role for the sort of an active role for the professions, of law, medicine, engineering, that sort of thing, in aiding this cooperation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you repeat the question?
Thank you. Good question. Question is there a role for the professions in Canada in helping on these issues and these concerns? And the answer is yes, absolutely. And after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gave its report, or with its report, it gave 94 calls to action. And a lot of those calls to action are directly addressed to the business community, to the legal profession, to teachers and other professions. I think that it's safe to say that the people who are working on solutions look to the professions in Canada as being integral to the way forward. So I have a friend who teaches law at U of T, and he's Cree, and he tells me that they are busy working on programs that will help sensitize attorneys to First Nations issues. The same things are going on with teachers. Murray Sinclair, who was one of the 3 commissioners in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he said, we educated ourselves into this problem. We're going to need to educate ourselves out of this problem. And so it's very important that the professions see themselves as being a part of the solution and have a moral responsibility. I would say a moral and legal responsibility to address these issues in a resolute way. So I could say more, but I think that's a good stab at it. So thank you for that question. It's very important. Yes.
I have a couple of questions.
Uh-huh.
Maybe I'll do them one at a time. The first one's pretty easy. You talk about what could we do as members of this congregation.
Yeah.
We can go to a powwow.
Uh-huh.
And that's important because that can bring some interaction
Yeah.
with our brothers and sisters in the indigenous world, nations. If we were being aware of some of the injustices and some of the issues that people face is very important to understand what's gone on, and certainly this is what Dr. Martin Luther King called people in the U.S. to look honestly at.
Yeah.
If there was one book that we could read, what book should we start with?
I would start with A Fair Country by Jonathan Ralston Saul, what I mentioned before. I think that's a great place to start for Canadians. I think it's a mind-expanding, a horizon-expanding work, and I think that's probably the best place to start. I think there's another level of awareness. You said it was a quick and easy answer, but but you're talking to a preacher, so I make my living by talking. So Martin Luther King said something that's important. He said, change doesn't come because one day someone who's been participated or benefited from an evil system decides they want to be good. Change always comes when an aggrieved person, people, an aggrieved population decides that they will no longer accept being subhuman. And when they stand up, this begins to create a change. And the people who have benefited from this situation, the people who are largely, I think, numbed by that benefit, right? They become aware that something is not right. And they become aware that they don't want to live in a way that hurts other people. And they begin to change the way they are. And that's what's going on in Canada right now, is that people are beginning to wake up to a situation that they, for the most part, weren't aware, and now they are. But I think that book is a great place for people to start. And it's pretty readable, and it's a great excursion through Canadian history. Yeah.
Thank you. My second question is a little more digging into what the church is doing in terms of taking a strong stand on some of the injustices that persist.
Yes.
That are being experienced by Indigenous women, Indigenous people,
Yes.
but Indigenous women in particular. So, for example, there are areas in Canada where, without consent, Indigenous women are being sterilized.
Yes. Yeah.
Is the church taking a stand on that, and how strong is that stand?
Yeah.
And is this the kind of thing where the church has a role to play in forcing the justice to be present in this situation where there's a lack of justice?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. The question that he's asking really is about the issues of gender justice or injustice in regard to Indigenous women in Canada. And this is one of the most serious and difficult areas that we have to deal with. And it is, in terms of the Indigenous church, a moment in anything we do. We can't sing a hymn without talking about the missing and murdered women. We can't talk any length of time without bringing that back. And that is right. That's the way it ought to be. You may not know this, but most indigenous cultures are matrilineal in terms of how they deal with things. Now, the Navajo people that I've spent a tremendous amount of time with are like the Dene people of Canada. They are matriarchal, matrilineal, and matrilocal. Now, what does that mean? It means that women are in charge, and that the name of the family is through the woman's side, and the identity is through the woman's side. So you identify yourself according to your mother, and your relationship with your mother is the most important relationship that you have. This aspect of life is an aspect of life that has been under attack, really, by the patriarchal norms of the larger dominant colonizing culture. So we're not only interested at a direct level at some of these issues, we're also interested in changing culture. And for us, that means really going back and rewriting our history and looking at things in a very different way. So we're dealing with it at a number of different levels. And the church just very quickly imposed upon indigenous peoples its patriarchal bias. And we are actively engaged in trying to undo that. We have three women bishops, which is we could still have more, and we should have more. But we're close to 50% of our clergy are women. So we're trying to deal with this as best we can. And in addition to the serious issues of women, which we're doing advocacy on, and I should say that one of the first acts that I did as the National Indigenous Bishop was to go to a national march on this issue. It was identified right away as something that they wanted me to concentrate on and to spend time on. So we're very committed to that. Thank you for that question. Yes, there's a question back here.
Would you comment a little on this, what you call indigenous wisdom?
Yes.
Maybe a couple of items under indigenous wisdom, which I think would be interesting.
Okay. There has been in Western thought, the thought that everybody is influenced by, including indigenous people, there has been a progressive alienation from the creation around, so that science, as good as it is, technology, as good as it is, has tended to isolate us from the relationship that we have to the rest of creation. One of the fundamental aspects about indigenous wisdom is the importance of the relationship that we have to the creation around us. And so the way that it's put in the Ojibwe context, it's called the Great Law of Life. And that Great Law of Life is fundamental to the indigenous way of life. The Great Law of Life is that all of life is responsible to the rest of life for its safety, well-being, and wholeness. And so indigenous wisdom sees the consequences of things. Now, how would that be seen? There's been a massive change in my lifetime in the way that we treat animals. Animals have become commodified to such an extent that the way that we treat chickens, for instance. My lovely daughter, who's 25, she refuses to eat turkey because of the way turkeys are treated. I think that comes from a I think that comes from an indigenous inspiration and source. Now, these things are not only immoral on the face of it, they also cause huge problems. When you treat animals like they're a commodity, you create problems that reverberate throughout the whole system. And I think those will become more and more real as time goes on. When I was young, although I grew up mostly in a city, we were out on the land quite often because of my father's work and my grandfather's work, and so we were out in the country. But I remember very well that we were counseled to treat animals in a good way. And the idea of animal husbandry had a moral component to it. And that is that when an animal serves you, you have a responsibility to treat them in a kind and humane manner. So you don't, as soon as a horse or a cow is no longer useful to you, you put them out to pasture. Remember that? Remember those kinds of things? Today, these ideas are eclipsed by the mad rush to make money off of animals and that sort of thing. So that is an aspect, one small aspect of indigenous wisdom. So that indigenous people are calling the rest of society to wake up and it's calling the rest of society to remember where food comes from and where our life comes from. Yes, you have another.
I think I've heard that when an animal has to be killed because of food for a person, they make a little prayer over it.
Yes.
And say thank you.
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
giving me what I need.
Yeah. Actually, indigenous people, for the most part, there's variations from tribe to tribe, from culture to culture, but for the most part, indigenous people believe that animals give themselves to us, sacrifice themselves to us. And like the Christian faith, which says at the heart of human experience, at the heart of creation, at the heart of the universe, you find sacrificial love. Indigenous people were attracted to Christianity and remain attracted because they too see sacrificial love as the heart of this universe in which we live. Sacrificial love is why parents serve their children. Sacrificial love is why a husband and wife love and care for each other. Sacrificial love is why the animals make themselves available to us. That's all of these things are seen as the fabric of the creation in which we live in. And so indigenous wisdom sees sacrificial love as the heart of the mystery of life that we are. In my sermon, I was talking about how the revelation of Jesus Christ unveils God's plan and mystery. A big part of what it unveils is that at the heart of our experience is this secret of sacrificial love. To understand that, to know that, is to live as a human being. And that would be a very indigenous insight as well as being a very Christian insight. So, thank you for that lovely question. Yes?
We've been very fortunate to, with our youth, to have developed a relationship with a community in the north, Mayo.
Yes, yeah, I understand that, yeah.
Which is fantastic, but I think one of the things that it certainly opened our eyes to is the barriers that exist between connecting young people with each other, which largely prevents or makes it very difficult for, particularly in places like Toronto, to truly appreciate what what an Indigenous experience looks like. Right?
Yeah.
What are the things that you would recommend? What would you? Are there suggestions that you could make helping us lower that, because you know, it's great that we were able to take 12 youth up there, but there are hundreds of thousands, like in Toronto, that you know we need to connect the dots for.
Yeah, thank you. The question is a good one. It's building upon the relationships that your congregation already has with Indigenous people and developed through your youth ministry. And the first thing that I would say is that it's important to maintain those relationships. Oftentimes, church youth mission trips go and then they come back and then they forget about it. I am heartened and encouraged by the ways in which I see all of you still engaged in that trip and what it means and to understand it. So I would build on that relationship. Everything in the Indigenous universe is relational. They don't, Indigenous folks don't really respond to a programmatic kind of thing. It has to be a relationship, not a project, really. And so I recommended the idea of powwows because that's a place where you can build relationship. And I think that there are a number of ways in which you can do it, but I think the first step is becoming aware of Indigenous things that are going on in your community. There was a powwow, an outdoor powwow that happened not too long ago, a few years ago, not too far from here, you know. By simply becoming more aware of what's going on in the community, you have the opportunity to build relationship. The most important thing, I mean, it's important to learn about these things, it's important to study these things, to raise them up in the parish context and be involved about them. But I think fundamentally it all gets back to relationship. So when I introduced myself to the 1030 congregation, I called you all my relations. But Ojibwe has a dubitative mode. So what I was really saying is, I think you might be my relatives. Now, you can look at that as hedging my bets, you know. But what I'm really trying to indicate is that it's a duty for me and hopefully an opportunity for you that we try to be in relationship, that we try to act as a relative. So there was a Navajo chief once, and he said that he had never been sick, and somebody asked him what was his secret, and he said, I treat everyone as if they were my family member. And that is at the heart of Indigenous wisdom, is to be in a relationship of a familial relationship and try as much as you can to do that. So my advice would be to try to develop relationships wherever and however and whenever you can. And it might be good to try to invite people here. They did a study in the 1980s. There were massive numbers of Indigenous people moving to urban areas in Canada, and they did a study. They interviewed Indigenous people who were moving from reserve into urban areas. And they found out that close to 100% of all of them visited a church within a month of arriving in that area. They found out that close to 100% of that number never went back. Now, what was it that happened? Now, I don't think it was because people were mean. I think there's just a cultural difference, right? And that, I think, added to the sense of loneliness. But I think you can be friendly to people in a way that invites them in. And I would hope that one of the things that we would see is more and more Indigenous people being part of congregations like yours. You know, there's a lot of them around. You know, they should be. You had another question.
Just follow up with that. And I think we've been fortunate, like I said, that relationship was something where the kids in Mayo came here, so that there was that kind of back and forth. But I guess what I'm really asking is for for young people, it's about spaces, right? It's about
Yeah.
finding spaces where you can
Yes.
convene and be together and all the rest of it. And,
Absolutely.
and going to, and we've seen it, like, going to a place or going to a place and like exposing yourself to it is one thing. Being able to have a space where you can have that conversation requires facilitation, requires like direction, requires some degree of like forethought and purpose.
Yeah.
And I guess those are hard to find, right? And it's more than just going out and saying, okay, well, I'm going to take them someplace, which we do, right?
Yeah.
It's like, is the church doing anything to try to foster those sorts of spaces?
Well, the quick answer is not enough. There's a lot to be done, and part of that is because we're just so busy dealing with putting out other fires that we don't have a time to do that. But I should say that were we asked, we would trip over ourselves. We would just love to help and would find a way to help. The reality of what we're doing, on the level of where I operate, is that we want to see these things happen. We encourage these things to happen. We help people to connect with people so that these things may happen. But we aren't going around and doing that as much as we would like because we have other issues and difficulties. But were there a request, we would certainly try to respond to that with vigor. Yeah. So, okay, all right. And it's not that I have more that I need to do, but this is something I would be happy to do. Yes. Now, David. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of, or the general public, are afraid of adding 3 more bishops in Canada.
Yeah.
That statement alone says that there's some sort of impression that it's going to cause more problems, or how many bishops are there in Canada total?
The active bishops, there's probably 35, 37, somewhere in that
so
number.
So the percentage of the number of bishops with the number of Indigenous people seems to be relative, that the 3 are required and maybe more are required?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, well, yeah. What we have is the church always looked at Indigenous people as being a mission out there, and the center of power, influence, money, culture, and ideas was always in central places like Toronto. So the idea was always to project power out to these remote communities. But the reality today is that there's more people involved percentage-wise in church out in the bush than there is here. And so we have to, part of it is changing perception, And so the church is still kind of locked into this idea that how do we get all of the riches of who we are out to these poor people out there? There has to be more of an exchange back and forth.
And there is a lot of news, there's a lot of press, there's a lot of education being made aware of to general Canadians, so I think it's really helping a lot.
Yes, you're right.
I don't see why there should be any fear. That's what I don't understand.
Well, thank you. I think I probably hung up a little bit of dirty laundry here. So I'm trying to be diplomatic and saying there's still things we need to work on, And so I spoke to the bishops just this past week. All of the bishops in Canada got together, and I pointed out to them that there were different priorities for leadership in Indigenous communities than there was in, suburban Toronto or that sort of thing. And this is, you could tell by looking at their faces that this kind of a light came on, because in a way, people, again, our orientation, the old mindset was, how do we get Toronto out to the bush? And now the mindset ought to be, how do we get the bush into Toronto? And that's, I think, the reality that we're dealing with. And so, so you often have bishops saying, well, how are these people trained? And that sort of thing. And they didn't go to my school, that sort of thing. And I'll tell you a story. When I was in the Bishop of Alaska, we had this guy who went in front of the Commission on Ministry. They were a group that interviewed clergy to see if they were fit to be ordained. And they said to me, Bishop, I don't even know why you let this guy in front of us. He could never last a minute in All Saints Anchorage. And I said, exactly, that's the whole point. He is someone who's really great in rural Alaska. And I said, I think he probably would be good in urban Alaska as well. But we're not looking for the same kind of leadership that you have in suburban Alaska as we are looking for out in the bush. It takes a very different kind of person, a very different kind of personality. And so this is a difficult thing because people tend to think, they habituate their ideas and their approaches. And so, very good question. Very, very good question. Thank you. Let's see. I think first here and then we'll go that way. Yeah.
My question is, the indigenous community is a bit of a two-edged sword.
Yes.
And I'm referring really back to the young people.
Yes.
And we only get it in the paper here that so-and-so has committed suicide. The suicide rate's very high.
Yeah.
Is that not a problem that the young people don't have a sense of purpose?
Yes.
But at the same time, if they have a sense of purpose, purpose is, I think, leaving the community. And yet the elders are trying to keep them there.
Yeah.
Because as they leave the community will ultimately die.
Yeah.
And I wonder where the happy medium is on that.
Well, I think that it's a very good question. The question was about young people and suicide and the relationship between their life in reserve community and outside. I think that what we're hoping to do is to provide economic possibility and hope in those communities in a way that is worthwhile. The present structure of the relationship of Indigenous communities to the rest of Canada is not conducive to the kind of solutions that we're looking for. But fundamental to it is a sense of hope. And suicide, among the many things that are involved, it's a very complex issue. But the biggest part that we see is the lack of hope. And so we see the issue of creating possibilities and avenues for Indigenous people. First of all, our hope would be that they would be able to stay home, which we understand is their desire. But second of all, failing that, to provide a way to feel connected to who they are in terms of their identity, even if they do move to urban Canada and those kinds of places. So it is something that's a part of the structure of our ministry. So, yeah. Let's see. Thank you for that question.
I have a somewhat mundane question.
All right.
It's sort of like that little town you didn't like.
A Holman question. Yeah, okay.
You are not a bishop in the sort of, diocesan sense where you don't, I assume you don't have a synod or any of that sort of thing, but what sort of administrative structure, what sort of governance do you have to help you in your work? And how is it funded?
Well, okay, so a gun and a mask. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Oh boy, don't quote me on that. But anyway, so we have a sacred circle which meets once every 3 years. It's a gathering of Indigenous people from all over Canada. And they set the vision and the tone for every 3-year period, just like General Synod. So we have an Indigenous equivalent of General Synod. And then we have an Anglican Council of Indigenous People that acts as an executive body in between General Synod. And I get a lot of my cues from them. In addition, Indigenous society has never really looked, it's kind of a leveling aspect to it. So the Navajo word for bishop means he or she sits at a slightly elevated place in the circle. So leadership is recognized, but you kind of, so I may be the National Indigenous Bishop, but I'm not the Grand Poobah of Indigenous people. I have to show respect for elders, particularly the grandmothers. In terms of indigenous knowledge and wisdom, I have to look to them. I have to, my strength and my authority is directly proportional to how well I give voice to the concerns of the people. As soon as I start giving voice to what I think is important, I lose authority. And frankly, I'll be yesterday's news. So that's how we look at authority and how it operates in our system. So we have a Indigenous House of Bishops Leadership Circle, which includes, which is roughly half women, half men, elders. It includes youth. It includes, and so I look to that group for advice and counsel. But my directions are very much overseen by the Anglican Council of Indigenous People, and that meets twice a year. I have an office at the church house of where the primate is, and I have an office there. It doesn't have to be there. I could be someplace else, but it's helpful because right now a big part of our budget comes from the national church budget. So in a sense, I guess you could say you guys are helping me do what I do. So your generosity to your parish helps the generosity to the diocese, which helps generosity to the national church. And so my bottom line is directly served and related to the bottom line of this congregation. So.
And the same council is the one that appoints you or elects you?
Yes. Well, I'm an oddball because I'm the first one out of the stall, you know. And so I was the Sacred Circle went to the primate at the time, Andrew Hutchinson, and said, we want 15 bishops with jurisdiction. Now, that was an impossible request. So he said, I'll give you one bishop without jurisdiction. And so they got me. So I'm the 15 bishops. But anyway.
The actual consecration of the bishop is done by the national church?
Right, yeah. The primate consecrates the national indigenous bishop, just as the primate consecrates the bishop ordinary to the armed forces. Yeah. So I'm directly I'm directly under or a part of the primate's ministry, and work with him carefully. I should say, however, that I don't see myself as serving the primate. He's my buddy. I don't think he disagrees with what I'm doing, but I think that he would agree that my priority is the people and specifically the elders. So I take my marching orders from the elders and the people, and I see my ultimate loyalty and responsibility to them. But organizationally, on the organization chart, I'm under the primate. Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
And we get along well. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Yes, yeah.
I was just going to mention, I work in a school in Peel, in Mississauga, and we do Skype with one of our classrooms, does Skype with a Indigenous classroom.
Nice.
And the kids talk back and forth. They email, they even do the old thing of writing letters and mailing them. And we've not met any of these people personally, but it's just been a really great way of the youth in the Peel schools. It's a really big, we have 2 teachers that are constantly going out for trainings and going away on weekends and that type of thing to learn and to be immersed in it so that they can come back and answer the questions of the children and also teach. And this is a kindergarten to grade 5 school.
Yeah, that's very good. I think very, very important. People, it used to be that you could grow up in Canada and have Indigenous people all around you and never notice that they were there. And that's no longer possible. I lived in Arizona for a time when I worked on the Navajo reservation. I went down to Phoenix one time and I met an Episcopalian there, Anglicans in the U.S., and they said, you know, what do you do? I said, well, I'm on the Navajo Nation. I work with Navajo people. And they said, oh, we have Indians here. Now, Arizona is one of the states with the largest indigenous population of any in the United States, but this person had lived in Arizona all her life and never really knew it. I think she thought that John Wayne had gotten rid of all of them. So anyway, so thank you. That's very, very good. Yes?
A couple of comments, but you as a preacher might well make them into something that you'll answer. There's one book that I know my wife's book group talked about, which is, I think his name is Thomas King, the Inconvenient Indian.
Yes.
And I read that too, and I found it a lovely book, partly because he's an incredible storyteller, so it's quite easy to read. Yeah. But it also has a lot of what it needs for us to raise our consciousness. So you would agree with that?
I would say that second only to A Fair Country, An Inconvenient Indian, if I had thought about that a little more. Virtually anything that Thomas King writes, but especially that one, is very good, and I would highly recommend it. Yeah.
And my second comment actually triggers on this being an anniversary of this church. I remember from a long time ago, I saw a large oil painting. And I haven't seen it for many decades, and there used to be a very large, very ancient oak tree at the west edge of the cemetery, and this painting was of Indigenous people gathering under that oak tree, watching the settlers come in their wagons pulled by horses coming to the church, obviously more than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So I mean, there has been, as you say, there's been a connection. Because we're all on the same land.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I was not just being funny when I said that people would have known what I was saying back then. There was obviously a lot more communication between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people 175 years ago than there has been since. And so, yeah, that's an important thing. And I think that's a place to build. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Anything else, or have I talked you under the table? Yeah. Yes.
Is the purpose of the church in dealing with the Indigenous people to try and keep these communities together? I'm thinking, for example, I think I'm correct in saying the Algonquins of Ontario, which are up and around the Ottawa River. Yeah. No longer have a central, I'm not sure the right word, a central community. I mean, most of them live either in North Bay, as I understand it, or in fact, the large majority are actually in Quebec. But they don't have a place that they can come together on.
Well, the question is about the Indigenous people are kind of dispersed in a number of different ways, and there was a specific example of the Algonquin people. And does the church have a role in gathering people and bringing them together? And yes, in many communities where our churches exist, and it doesn't have to be our particular denomination, but the church is one of the central places in the community, and it has tended to be a place that gathers people and gives them a sense of identity. A lot of people, when they move to a new area, they carry their church with them as a part of their identity. This is also true of Indigenous people. And the Anglican Church is one of the largest churches among Indigenous people, and so we should have a lot more Indigenous Anglicans involved with our church, but that hasn't, for a number of reasons, hasn't happened. But in general terms, Indigenous churches are a big part of the gathering of the community. I have one of the clergy that I work with very closely in a community called Shamattawa. She told me that she slipped around in her vehicle on some ice. She called up the chief and she said, "Chief, you better do something about that ice. If something happens to me, who's going to do the funerals and the weddings around this place?" You know, and so that's something that I don't imagine that our mayor in Toronto hears very often, but in indigenous communities, the church is really woven into the fabric of everyday life, and so that often is carried with people to urban areas, and we're hoping to really capitalize on that and help Indigenous people gather in urban areas as well. So thank you. Good. Yeah, good. Yes, the priest is rising, so I think it's time for me to sit down.
Well, no, I'm mindful of the time, but I wanted to, on behalf of everyone here at St. George's, profound thank you for coming and joining us and kicking
pleasure.
off our 175th anniversary and sharing your experience and joys of being the Indigenous Bishop of Canada. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be here. I loved your worship. I love the fellowship here, and I'm very impressed by your priest. And so don't forget about me. Invite me back sometime. So,